Hi, this is Siddharth Varadarajan of The Wire, and I will be discussing during this Facebook Live event the surgical strikes that India conducted against terrorist targets in Pakistan. I hope to answer questions that you might have on the operation. Not that there's much more that I can add. The government of India has been quite parsimonious with information, and the Pakistani side, of course, has flatly denied that any such incident took place. But reading between the lines and as far as events on the ground are concerned, I will try to construct as accurate a picture of what might have happened and where we go from here over the next days, weeks and months. Are we entering a situation where we will gradually see a ratcheting up of tension between India and Pakistan? In other words, moving from rhetoric to the first kind of kinetic action which we saw yesterday, then perhaps leading to some kind of Pakistani response. Will that be the pattern, albeit on a slow fuse? Or will the current crisis die down after a few days because Pakistan decides it doesn't want to escalate? India decides that it sent as clear a message as needed to be sent at this time, and the international community also essentially prevails on the Pakistani side, but also on the Indian side, to dial back a bit on the tension. We saw initial statements from the US State Department and Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, both of whom counseled India and Pakistan to, in a way, reduce tensions. One could, if one likes, read that message, particularly the American one, as a sign primarily to Pakistan in the first instance, because Pakistan, as the country that India says was targeted, would naturally or would logically be expected to respond. Is the American statement aimed at telling the Pakistani side that you should not respond, you should not retaliate, but you should look to calm things down and also fulfill your obligations as far as not allowing your territory to be used for attacks against India? So these are the broad set of issues that we will be discussing in the next half an hour. So feel free to fire away with your questions. The dramatic development of last night and today, of course, is the fact that there is an Indian soldier in Pakistan's custody. There is he's from the 37th Rashtriya Rifles, 37 Rashtriya Rifles, and the Indian side says he inadvertently crossed the line of control during the operation. What we're looking at is a funny sort of paradox. The Indian side says that it conducted surgical strikes, and even though the government of India has not said so in so many words, the implication is, and the media has reported it this way, that Indian commandos crossed the line of control to conduct raids perhaps as deep as 2 or 3 kilometers inside Pakistani-held territory. So despite admitting that India conducted those strikes inside Pakistan's territory, presumably with the use of personnel who crossed the line of control, the Indian side says that this particular soldier who is in Pakistan's custody is someone who crossed the line of control inadvertently. And on the Pakistani side, you have the Pakistanis who flatly deny that there was any kind of surgical strike. They flatly deny that any Indian soldier crossed the line of control to inflict damage on their side, and yet they have this soldier in their custody. Now, either the soldier crossed over as part of an operation of some kind, because it's a bit of a coincidence that the first time we hear of a soldier inadvertently crossing the line of control and getting captured by the Pakistani side happens to be on the night that India conducted surgical strikes. So clearly the two events are linked. So it's paradoxical that India insists that this soldier crossed inadvertently, and the Pakistani side, which denies that any Indian attack took place, has to explain how come this Indian soldier is in fact in their custody if he didn't cross the line of control. Let me now look at questions. Mohit Mehta asks, do you think it could be the case that the strikes actually haven't taken place and the army is only coming out with the press release in order to pacify the war-hungry public of the nation. No, I don't agree with this. I don't think this is the case. I think something definitely did happen. The choice of words, surgical strikes, is important, right? Because the word, the phrase traditionally means the sort of application of targeted military force on a location that is not under your control ordinarily, right? That's in enemy territory. How you target that location, the form of surgical strikes. Now, conventionally, people are attuned, particularly in the context of American airstrikes, to think, or American surgical strikes, to think in terms of airstrikes. So airstrikes will be the first method, obviously. We also know that surgical strikes are carried out by commandos who raid into hostile territory. Surgical strikes could also take the form of a missile attack on a particular location, for example, a cruise missile. The US has resorted to missiles fired at a great distance, and those would also be classified as a surgical strike. And of course, you also have targeted firing using artillery or mortar at very specific locations, could also arguably fall under the rubric of surgical strikes. The Pakistanis insist that all that the Indians have done is to escalate firing along the line of control. The Indian side, by not elaborating on what form these surgical strikes took, essentially, it's not disclosing the method employed. I suppose there may be military reasons for this, although presumably the enemy or the country or the location where you did this knows exactly what you did. So there's no sense in hiding the broad contours of the operation. So for whatever reason, the Indian side has chosen not to divulge details. But I would imagine that the briefing given to opposition parties and to primarily the opposition parties and the response of the opposition parties, where a lot of these questions would have been put across, suggests that this is no bluff. This is something which actually has taken place. Even if the significance of this in terms of its ability to deal with terrorism is uncertain. But I would not doubt that the incident, something serious did indeed happen. Kashi Randhava asks, according to Indian media, the whole operation was filmed by drone. Then where are video proofs and details about targets? Well, this is a question similar to Mohit Mehta's. The army and the government has chosen not to divulge any details about the operation on the record. I would imagine that they have evidence of this, not just in order to present it should the occasion arise, but also because this is part of important learning experience of the Indian Army for having conducted this kind of an operation. So I would imagine that this kind of evidence does in fact exist, but don't imagine that this material will be placed in the public domain anytime soon. I would imagine as a first step, the government of India would at some point provide more details or put more details in the public in the public sphere about what form the operation took. But so far, as I said, other than the phrase surgical strikes, nothing has been said on the record. Nishant Saxena asks, Pakistan continues to say there was no surgical attack. The Quint a few days back did an exclusive about Indian Army attacking Pakistani posts. Are media reports really reliable, or is it another race to report first and confirm later? Well, the Quint story was very controversial at the time when it was reported, I think on the 20th or the 21st, when they claimed that helicopters had flown across and a large operation was conducted, and there was a mention of several casualties running into 200. The report seemed incredulous. The army, off the record, denied it. But in the light of what happened yesterday, Quint, of course, says that this proves the story was correct. My response would be to say, well, if the government of India had no problem going public with the surgical strike conducted on the night of the 28th and early morning 29th, why would it not have gone public describing the surgical strike done on the 20th or the 21st as the Quint had reported? So to my mind, the fact that the government has gone public with this operation casts doubts about the veracity of that earlier story. I wouldn't say anything more than that. I should add that Quint, of course, competes with The Wire, so everything I say about it should be taken with a pinch of salt. Ravi Deka says, isn't cross-border incursion and localized engagements a regular feature on the LOC? Why this hullabaloo this time? Yeah, well, military people say that raids have been conducted by the Indian Army in the past, and that these have never been publicized, as we know, because governments have never spoken about them. There was supposedly an incident in 2013 when Manmohan Singh was the Prime Minister, and military analysts trace the history of cross-LOC surgical incursions against targets of opportunity by the Indian Army all the way back to 2003-2004 when General Joshi was the army chief. So there is a history, a tradition of this. The Pakistanis also are known to have crossed the LOC and conducted attacks on Indian positions. The well-known incident of 2013 January when an Indian soldier was beheaded. It was in response to that incident that Indian soldiers crossed the LOC to avenge the death of their comrade. So these things have been happening. What is different, and why I feel, and I used the phrase paradigm shift in my analysis yesterday, was that by going public, there is a certain signaling which is being done by the government, not just to Pakistan but also to the world, and I think that is what makes this incident different. It's not that raids didn't happen in the past, but that the government has chosen to up the ante, to take us a little bit higher up the escalatory ladder. That is significant, that is new. Okay, Meenakshi Iyer asks, what covert or overt role will China play now? The Chinese stand has been very muted. If you recall, Meenakshi, even during Kargil, for example, when Pakistani soldiers crossed the line of control and conducted, and essentially occupied Indian territory for several weeks, the Chinese were always counseling restraint on the Pakistani side, and finally, the Pakistanis, when Nawaz Sharif went to Peking, and of course General Musharraf, General Aziz, who was the army commander, they went to Peking. The counsel they received from the Chinese was, look, you better back down. And finally the Pakistani side had to back down. So my sense is that even though there is a strong geopolitical or strategic affinity between China and Pakistan, when it comes to military tension between India and Pakistan, the Chinese, like other great powers, do not believe that a military confrontation or military tension between these two countries, even if it may offer tactical advantages to Pakistan, is something that is in the Chinese interest. So I would imagine that the Chinese response and advice to the Pakistanis would be to act with restraint, to calm down, and to do what they can to deliver on their commitments to not provide shelter to various terrorist groups. We ought to remember that that is the bottom line here, that Pakistan plays host to a whole bunch of unsavory characters who roam around publicly and make public speeches and openly threaten Indian soldiers, Indian civilians. They boast about conducting operations on the Indian side, and the least that Pakistan ought to do is to put a stop to their activities and a stop to their speeches. The fact that Pakistan has not done that, despite committing to do so in 2004, and despite UN Security Council resolutions and the good counsel of all of its friends, I think that's what really creates, injects a certain amount of volatility into the situation. So I think the Chinese position at the end of the day is not going to be all that different. The covert or overt role will be, I think, to counsel restraint on the part of Pakistan. Mr. Abdul Kalam Azad asks, there is no news of stone pelting or otherwise in the last few days. How do you see this development impacting on the Kashmiris? My sense is that the stone pelting or the of exhaustion, people have mobilized themselves now for more than 2 months, and I think the continuous calendar of hartals and bands and strikes and shutdowns has taken its toll on the capacity of ordinary Kashmiris to sustain this kind of an operation, sustain this kind of movement. So I would rather, I would say that one shouldn't confuse what is happening in the valley, which is a political problem that, to my mind, India has grievously mishandled, with the situation on the line of control, where there can be there are no two narratives here. Pakistan is under an obligation not to allow its territory to be used to attack India, and India is within its rights to expect that Pakistan abide by that obligation. So one shouldn't confuse these two situations. They are linked in a broader sense, supposedly, But I think in terms of the issue of immediate concern, there is a military challenge that India has to deal with, and there is a political challenge that India needs to deal with. So far, it seems to be more willing to deal with the military challenge from Pakistan and from the terrorist groups, and is rather unwilling to address or deal with the political challenge posed by the grievances of Kashmiris. One would hope that when temperatures cool down a little, New Delhi will turn its attention to that. Amit Pratap Singh asks, do you support the view of some columnists who say that India should not have conducted this operation because it doesn't solve the real problem? The fact is that military planners would have tried to calibrate this action in such a way that you inflict some damage, thereby trying to condition Pakistani behavior, but at the same time not crossing a certain threshold, which would then compel the Pakistanis to respond in a way that would be unpleasant or unwelcome to your side. And in striking this kind of balance, there's always the danger that what you end up doing is so below the threshold that it really makes no difference. And I think, given the fact that the Pakistani side has flatly denied Indian claims about any surgical strike having been conducted, this would suggest that the punitive or the deterrent value of these surgical strikes is rather limited. So, yes, India is sending a message to Pakistan that there is no more business as usual, but the nature of the message sent, or the manner in which the message was delivered, is perhaps one that may not condition or may not goad the Pakistani side into altering its behavior when it comes to sponsorship of terrorist groups. So there is this problem. So yes, days or weeks down the line, we may well find that these surgical strikes, from the point of view of a military goal or a strategic goal of curbing terrorism, have proved ineffective. That point may well come, and then of course the danger would be that the Indian side would look for something harder, something sharper, and there of course you would have to factor in the kind of response that that would come from the Pakistani side, which is why, as an analyst, I have always felt that this approach is, it yields very uncertain benefits, and in terms of what India's objectives are, and so far what's been done appears to be rather safe, keeping it within a certain kind of parameter that would not lead to unnecessary escalation. But for that very reason, its military effectiveness is probably rather limited. Bala Subramaniam asks, does the Geneva Convention apply for the captured soldier? Absolutely it does. The Geneva Convention applies to any soldier who is injured or captured. The only exception would be if there is an allegation of the soldier donning the uniform of an enemy country. That is clearly not the case here, and I would imagine that Pakistan would have to abide by its obligations under the Geneva Convention. That it has not always done so in the past is a different matter. But I think that given the publicized nature of his being in custody, and the fact that and the context in which he appears to have fallen into Pakistani hands, I would imagine that the Pakistani side would place a premium on his being treated well. Akhil Tandul Wadikar asks, what are the risks, if any, associated with the government deciding to go public about the operation? Good question. The risk is essentially that you then force the Pakistani side, you put the Pakistani side under public pressure to respond, right? So going public means that you are sending a message not just to the Pakistani army, but to the Pakistani public, wider body politic. And if the Pakistani public sphere is anything as raucous or toxic as the Indian one, you can well imagine that publicizing these kinds of strikes would lead to the build-up of enormous public sentiment and pressure for Pakistan to respond in some kind of dramatic way. And when this kind of pressure builds up in a democracy, or even in a country like Pakistan, where the military calls the shot and isn't really answerable in a democratic way, unlike a government, but the danger always arises that decisions on how to respond, how to use force, where to use force, become conditioned not necessarily by professional considerations entirely, but by public sentiment. And I think that's where the danger lies, that if military men and women end up taking decisions on the use of force that are not 100% driven by a purely professional assessment of aims, objectives, consequences, but rather are fueled by or driven by public sentiment or a xenophobic or jingoist media, that's where the danger lies. And I think in going public, this is one factor that we need to keep an eye on. Padmaja Shaw asks, has India lost the moral high ground by declaring the strikes? More importantly, has it now exposed itself to similar treatment under some pretext or another in future? Well, the Indian stand would be that, look, we have taken hit after hit, going back many years. In the last year alone, as the DGMO said, you have Uri and Pathankot and Pooch as fairly high-value targets that the Pakistani-based terror groups have struck, but there are lots of other attempts made, and one is not even beginning to count the number of times that civilian targets in the rest of India have been hit. So, the Indian side would say, well, yes, there is a risk in inviting retaliatory action, but we've been putting up with terrorist violence for many years without responding, and maybe the time has now come to try something new. So that would be the conventional answer to the question you're asking. As for the moral high ground, I would say, the fact of the matter is that for one reason or the other, and this has to do with geopolitics, it has to do with political economy, it has to do with the world getting quite tired of Pakistani behavior vis-a-vis terrorist groups. I think there's a great deal more sympathy today for India and India's situation and the kind of choices India is making than there was even in 2001, 2002, when in the aftermath of 9/11, when the US tore up every rule book of international law in order to invade Afghanistan, and there was a suggestion that, look, why can't India do the same thing in response to Parliament being attacked? And you saw the way in which international public opinion came down on the government of India like a ton of bricks. I think today the situation is completely different. The number of countries that are leaning heavily on India not to act is very, one doesn't see any of those statements. The US statement, even in the aftermath of the announcement on surgical strikes, has been very guarded. He was asked, the State Department spokesman was asked, how do you characterize these surgical strikes? Would you characterize them as something that is an escalation? And he said no. So I think that these are significant markers of the way in which international politics has changed, international public opinion has changed, and I think that this is what gives the government of India greater freedom to maneuver, but that freedom has to be exercised in a responsible way. And this comes to the heart of the question that I think you're asking, which is the ultimate political, diplomatic wisdom of doing what it has done. I think if the Indian side can ensure that there is no further escalation and that your message is delivered and that the Pakistani behavior vis-a-vis these groups changes, then all's well that ends well. The danger, of course, is that neither has your message gone through, nor will there be any change in the ISI's attitude or the attitude and activities of these terrorist groups, and there will be a Pakistani response, which would then lock you into a situation where the public would expect the government to act in an even harsher manner, and that's really the problem. Deborshi Brahmachari asks, why isn't there enough anti-war talk in the Indian and Pakistani media? Well, the media in this country and in Pakistan is consumed by jingoism at the best of times, even in the absence of major strikes, major terrorist attacks, or other sorts of tensions. It doesn't take much to whip up nationalist hysteria in India or Pakistan. What I've seen over the last 20 years of working in the Indian media industry, as it were, is that reporters, editors, TV channels, newspapers that are normally quite unwilling to accept the government line on political matters, on economic matters, on social matters, when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to so-called issues of national security, are much more willing to stand at attention, and accept what the government, either on this side or that side, is saying. And this is, the Malays whose outcome you are seeing in the kind of hyper-patriotic, hyper-nationalist reporting that has characterized the last 24 to 48 hours in India as well as in Pakistan. I think what we need is for journalists to ask more questions, to try to understand the situation on the ground, and to push governments to disclose as much information as they can. And clearly, this is the surgical strikes from the point of view of military necessity, or from the point of view of the need to keep information secret. Given that you stage these operations in territory under Pakistani control, and that the people you attacked and those who support them know precisely what you did. If you went in by helicopter, they know you went in by helicopter. If you sent 20 guys to a certain post, they know you sent 20 guys to a certain post. They probably know which unit they came from. But even without disclosing particulars about units and so on, even a broad brush indication of the precise nature of the operation is something that the government ought to share with the public. This is quite normal in many countries. The only reason I can imagine the government is unwilling to do that, and this is a benign explanation, and I hope this is the right one, that by the more specifics you go into, right? If you say that I went to location A and B and killed 6 guys and so on and so forth, it becomes harder for Nawaz Sharif and Raheel Sharif on the Pakistani side to flatly deny that no incident happened at all. So the more specifics you load into the public domain, the harder it becomes for Pakistan to represent what happened as merely firing along the line of control. And the consequence of that would be public clamor in Pakistan to respond in some way that would cause harm on the Indian side. And I would imagine that's the only reason, or perhaps the main reason, why, for now at least, the government is not talking about what exactly it did. Ishan JJ asks, is this a political make-up from both sides to gain support of their people and continue their political reign for longer? What about role of the US and other war equipment sellers who would enjoy a win-win situation? Look, Ishan, what you say is theoretically right. Every ruling establishment knows and recognizes that creating a warlike situation is a wonderful way to divert attention from domestic problems to which they have no answer. And it is true that every warlike situation creates enormous opportunities for profiteering by arms dealers, by weapon sellers, which includes, of course, the United States, Russia, China, and so on. But I don't think that is the fundamental dynamic that is playing here. Yes, one of the reasons why the Modi government may have chosen to act and to publicize its action could be to essentially burnish its credentials as being a party with a difference. Let's not forget that Prime Minister Modi made all kinds of promises over the last, in the course of getting elected, and it's been 2 years from now, and there is a lot of, public frustration with the failure to deliver on those promises, and appearing tough and decisive on an issue like terror, on an issue like Pakistan, certainly goes down well with public opinion. So I wouldn't rule out this being a factor in Prime Minister Modi's decision to go public with the course of action that he has chosen to adopt. But it's not as if previous governments did not adopt a similar course of action. As I said earlier in this transmission, going back all the way to 2002, 2003, there have been incidents, unpublicized, of troops crossing the LC in order to inflict punishment on targets of opportunity. What's new this time is that the government has chosen to speak about it. And while there could be political reasons for that, or there is certainly an enormous amount of political benefit, there is a plausible military and diplomatic explanation as well for why the Modi government may have chosen to go public on this. So I would say that I would advise us to perhaps keep and hold our cynicism for the moment about this entire operation being driven purely and only by political motives. There is a problem of cross-border terror. There is a problem of cross-border violence that needs to be dealt with. And having tried a number of methods, although not very consistently, I think that one could certainly critique the flip-flops we've seen in the Modi government's approach to Pakistan in the last 2 years, it's logical, or certainly it is understandable, that the government says that we want to try something new. Nishant Saxena says, why should people believe India's claim of a surgical strike? This looks more like a political party trying to save its image before the upcoming assembly elections, including Punjab and Uttar Pradesh. Well, yeah, this is a point of view, and I would say that the more the information flow is from the government, the greater the information and details that are placed in the public domain, the better it would be, I think, because in the absence of information, there will be a lot of cynicism, there will be a lot of speculation about this operation being driven by political considerations. So I think it's in the government's interest to be as transparent as possible about what exactly was done and how it was done, so that the public understands and knows. As I said, keeping in mind the need to keep confidential any information that needs to be for military or security reasons. But other than that, I think there's no reason why the government should not certainly provide more details, and the more it does, I think the less will be the frequency or the degree of cynical questioning about political motivations having driven this entire operation. Indranil Chaudhary asks, what's your opinion about what AG is doing every night in his channel? I'm not sure what you mean by AG. Okay, Arnab Goswami. Okay, yeah. Well, in my view, Times Now is absolutely, how should I put it? Well, I'll be blunt. It's the worst channel, without a doubt. And the kind of atrocious commentary that is aired on that show night after night, the kind of vitriol and bile that is dished out, has nothing whatsoever in common with journalism. I'm not sure it's particularly entertaining either. Earlier the defense was that, well, this is entertainment, it's not news. So it's not news, it's not entertaining either. I'm not sure what it is, but it's a show full of freaks and monsters, and you will be well advised to keep away from it. Fateh Bajwa asks, border villages evacuation only in Punjab and not Rajasthan. Any thoughts? Well, I suppose the pattern of the density of settlements along the border in Punjab is higher than Rajasthan. But I would imagine that there are precautionary measures being taken in Rajasthan too. So I would say wait and watch on this. This is one of the few alarming consequences that we're already seeing, because it's obvious that the Indian side is bracing for some kind of Pakistani response. As I wrote in my analysis yesterday, the response can come in one of several ways, either shelling along the line of control or the international border, or perhaps encouraging terrorist groups to launch something at a soft target, either in India or in Afghanistan, say. These are things that the Indian Army, the Indian intelligence agencies will have to watch out for, and certainly firing along the LC insofar as it jeopardizes the lives of tens of thousands of villagers living along the border and the line of control is the first priority. And I think going by past precedent and past vulnerabilities, the army is advising the kind of evacuation that they are. Preet Singh says, is media hype good for surgical strikes? Would it not put a lot of pressure on Pakistan and hurt them? Yeah, you're right. I mean, the fact is that, and I think that's why perhaps the government chose to be parsimonious in the information it put out. So by giving a limited amount of information, that actually allowed the Pakistani side to credibly claim that all that happened was firing across the line of control. And if you read the Pakistani papers or watch Pakistani television, I appeared on a show last night where every one of the guests, and this was I think on Dawn TV, which is one of their better channels, every one of the guests there essentially was fully convinced that there was no surgical strike of any kind, that India is lying, that India is fabricating, and that this is all part of a psychological warfare, not just against Pakistan, but against the people of India to mislead them. So everybody on the Pakistani side believes this. And one reason why they are perhaps doing so is because the scale of the cross-border surgical strikes and the information that the government of India has put out about them allows the Pakistanis to believe that that is indeed all that happened. So I think that media hype does not help. I think media hype only pushes countries towards greater and greater escalation, and it is essential that governments make responsible use of the media and that journalists don't allow themselves to be used as a vehicle for warmongering. Amit Pratap Singh asks, what, according to you, is the ideal form or strategy India should adopt against the asymmetric war waged by Pakistani irregulars supported by military brass in Pakistan? Well, I'm not even remotely a military professional. All I can say is that whatever form you use to respond or to act against the Pakistani side has to be based on a careful calculation of costs and benefits. And I would imagine that the people who chose the form of action that took place on the night of the 28th did so on the basis of some kind of cost-benefit ratio. And it does seem to me that the costs were rather low. We are told that only one Indian soldier got injured during the exfiltration process, and there were no other casualties on the Indian side. And even if we accept for the moment that the Indian soldier who is in Pakistani custody is somebody that fell into the Pakistanis' hands because he was part of this kind of operation, costs are low, but the benefits also appear rather unclear at this time. So the problem with the use of military force is that the method you choose in order to remain firmly below a certain escalatory threshold invariably fails to produce the kind of military benefit that prompted you to act in the first time. And the minute you try to break away from that, you then go up the escalatory ladder, and this is the kind of situation that many analysts have warned will get triggered if India begins to pursue a purely military response or a largely military response to across the border to the threat posed by terrorists. I would say that the most important factor that I would lay emphasis on would be internal hardening. I think it is a crying shame that despite what happened in Pathankot, where an Air Force base was attacked, you could have a situation where soldiers in Uri were left completely exposed to this sort of attack, and attention was not paid to perimeter security and to various other measures. So I think that in the short to medium term, India would benefit perhaps militarily a great deal more if it could improve its internal systems of security management rather than going in for these kinds of dramatic operations which have an uncertain yield. Mr. Fani Sharma says, do you expect the classified evidence to be filtered and then put forward for the public in a few days' time? I would imagine so. As I said, this is not evidence that conceivably benefits terrorists or the Pakistani military, because they were there when they were hit. So they know exactly the method that was used to hit them. So if they know, and the Lashkar-e-Taiba knows, and the Jaish-e-Mohammed knows, then certainly there should be no military harm in giving details to the Indian public. And I would imagine that after a certain amount of time has elapsed, this information can be shared. As I said, the only conceivable reason why you may not want to do that is if you fear that giving details in the public domain would then encourage or goad the Pakistani side to respond in a way that you don't want them to respond right now. Sandeep Singh Khetwal asks, is proclaiming strikes just a political mileage for ruling party, or will India profit from it? Well, yeah, you cannot discount the fact that for the BJP, this is a move that that they hope will yield great political dividend, right? Ram Madhav is already writing op-eds about how this shows how Modi is a different sort of prime minister. Whereas, as I said, the fact is that earlier prime ministers have also authorized strikes of one kind or the other. So there will clearly be an attempt by the BJP to profit from this politically, and the best way for other parties to deal with this is for them to not nitpick, but to actually welcome this decision. And you could see that very clearly in statements that the Congress party has made. Sonia Gandhi's press release yesterday, Rahul Gandhi's statement today, where he was being a bit cheeky when he said that this is the best thing Modi's done in 2.5 years. But at the end of the day, the Congress party has lined up behind the government because it calculates that not doing so will actually allow the BJP to politically exploit this even more than it is naturally going to be able to do. Thomas Winnie asks, what profit and loss this situation meant to giant Indian corporates if the tension escalates? Interesting question. The first reaction of Sensex was to lose great value. I think shareholders panicked, and even today the tone and tenor of all the business channels has been, is the situation going to get out of control? Will things get worse? Will there be more tension? Will there be more escalation? So it is natural for the corporate sector, for financial investors to worry about the consequences of this. And I would imagine net today, as things stand, the Indian business class as a whole, even though there have been moments in history in different countries when corporate sector has fully backed a war-like situation, I don't think the Indian business class today believes that a war with Pakistan is in their economic or financial interest. And I would imagine that they too would be looking at the situation very carefully and hoping that the situation does not escalate. Shikha Samant asks, any update on the captured Indian soldier? None really. What we have heard only so far is Rajnath Singh saying that every effort is being made to have him returned. And I would imagine that the Pakistani side will first mull over. So I think he would be there for a few more days, perhaps a week, before he is allowed to rejoin his unit on the Indian side. Last question. If the Indian Army really killed militants in Pakistan, why can't they produce the video in the UN to prove the allegations of Pakistan being a terrorist state? This is a question by Nishant Saxena. Well, what the government chooses to disclose and what use they make of this information is really going to be dictated by their assessment of a number of factors. And as I said, the primary driver here is to see how the Pakistani side is going to respond, and to make sure that the Pakistani side does not escalate in a way that you are not prepared to deal with it, or in a way that would inflict unacceptable damage on yourself. And to that extent, I think releasing visual evidence and making a big song and dance today or tomorrow or day after about this operation would, from that point of view, be counterproductive. Maybe further down the road, when tensions along the border have calmed, there would be time and place for some of this evidence to be placed in the public domain. Okay, I really have to go in a few minutes, but last few questions. Narayan Lakshman asks, in not taking a stronger line against India's action, for example, in Susan Rice's call to Deauville, is the US tacitly encouraging Indian adventurism? Can you discuss Washington's calculus on this? Well, I think the first point is that Susan Rice, both the American and the Indian side are saying now that Rice's call to Deauville actually happened before the Indian action. Maybe it was prompted by an apprehension on the American side that the Indians were up to something. The Indians flatly deny that Deauville advised Susan Rice that we are about to do this. So, we don't know really what transpired in that conversation, but the public messaging after that conversation, Narayan, you saw the statement put out by the White House in the early hours of Thursday, Indian Standard Time, by when certainly the US would have picked up information about the fact that there was an ongoing operation. The fact that the White House nevertheless put out a fairly strong worded statement condemning the Uri incident, condemning and urging Pakistan to come good on its commitments, is one indication, was an early indication of the way the US's wind was blowing. But I think even more concrete is the White House statement after, which in a way urges restraint on both India and Pakistan, but the burden of that clearly falls upon Pakistan, which is expected by its people to retaliate in some way. And then the White House, then the State Department press conference, where despite being asked repeatedly whether he would characterize the Indian surgical strikes as an escalation, the State Department spokesman refused to get drawn into that and instead kept talking about Uri. So I think that yes, the US is calculating that the Indian government perhaps is justified in being angry against Pakistan and in acting in the way that it's acting, and is maybe confident that the Indian side will stay within certain escalatory limits, but that of course depends on the kind of response that Pakistan comes up with. So I would hope that the American policymakers today are expending their energy in counseling Pakistan to end this standoff by coming good on their promises made in January 2004 when Musharraf was the president and Atal Bihari Vajpayee visited Islamabad, that Pakistan will not allow its territory or territory under its control to be used for any kind of terrorist activities. And I think the sooner Pakistan comes good on that promise, the path to the easing of tension with India, diplomatic and military, would be opened up. And I would imagine that there the US has a major role to play. Nirjar Bose asks, is there any possibility of war in the near future, keeping in mind that both the countries have nuclear weapons? In my view, no. I think that this there is a slow fuse, and we will perhaps see escalation of a very limited kind, but this will come to an end well before even conventional warfare across the entire front. We're not even going to go near that, in my opinion. So to talk of nuclear weapons or nuclear weapon use, in my view, is very, very far-fetched. Shrishti Duggar asks, how has isolating Pakistan through SAARC helped India? I'm not very convinced about this, quite frankly. I think that within SAARC there is a dynamic largely driven by Pakistan's own bad relations with several countries, primarily India and Afghanistan and Bangladesh. And as long as this dysfunctionality exists, SAARC will remain a divided house. India can take great satisfaction in the fact that its decision to boycott the Islamabad summit was endorsed by both Afghanistan and Bangladesh, and of course Bhutan. But then Bhutan typically follows India's lead on foreign policy matters, and but I think in reality it doesn't really. So it now turns out that Sri Lanka also will not be participating in so SAARC summit is off for all intents and purposes, and but I'm not sure that this really helps advance India's cause, because the name of the game isn't really, in my view, isolating Pakistan within SAARC, because Pakistan's links to SAARC are anyway limited. Its relations with Afghanistan are bad, and its relations with its other SAARC neighbor, which is India, are terrible. So there's not much that Pakistan is doing or can do in SAARC in any case. It's more important to find ways of putting pressure on Pakistan to end its support for terror. I'm not sure boycotting SAARC is necessarily a very effective way. Vikram Kumar asks, Pakistan is a rogue state, a state on the brink of failure. Its democratic institutions are nearly dysfunctional. It's an open fact that nuclear arsenals are controlled by its military. So this adventurism/misadventurism by the Indian state can escalate into a limited nuclear war with catastrophic consequences. Your take? Well, I don't agree with that, Vikram. First of all, I don't agree with this characterization of Pakistan as a failed state. Even the phrase rogue state sounds nice rhetorically, but let's not forget that this is a country of 200 million people, vibrant civil society, and it's a country with links all across the world. Its people are all across the world, and states of this kind don't just vanish, don't just descend or disintegrate in the way that common parlance people assume that it will. So I think that Pakistan is, and if you actually look at the statistics in terms of the Pakistani economy, for example, you'd be surprised at how its growth rates are reasonable, and it does not look like a country on the brink of breaking up. And I think that we need to factor that into our calculus. And I don't think that Pakistani nuclear weapons are in danger of falling into the wrong hands and being used. So I would rule out the possibility of a catastrophic nuclear war. Arjit Dabas, do you think the government has given in to media pressure and gone for the strike, or does it look like a planned move? Well, as I said, there is a sense in which media hysteria and public hysteria influence. This does drive governments. One only hopes that the calculation made on striking, what to strike, how to strike, was done on purely professional grounds and not with the view to placating public opinion, because if that is the case, then that it will invariably compromise the nature of your professional assessment. So I would hope that the Government of India's actions have been driven purely by professional considerations and not by the jingoism that we see in the media. And I think, judging by what we've seen so far in terms of what's officially being said, there's no reason to be overly worried that what we are seeing is entirely being driven by these media channels. Last question, Thomas Irwin D'Souza. Even the US does not fully divulge the details of sensitive military operations to its media, and broadly its media accepts the government's version of events. Why is it only the Indian media so hell-bent on suspecting and trying to prove that this operation did not take place? Does certain section of media have any other agenda? I think I resent your question, Thomas Irwin D'Souza, because it's not as if we are irresponsible people here. We know exactly what we write about, what we talk about, and people who write on these matters have dozens of years of experience, and their love of the country or their loyalty ought not to be questioned by people like you. The fact is that information that is of a sensitive military nature obviously ought not to be disclosed. But as I said, the US did not hide the fact that it conducted an operation that went into Abbottabad and killed Osama bin Laden and captured some other people, and that there were 2 helicopters involved, and that 1 helicopter crashed. This is all information that Al-Qaeda and the Pakistani side already have. So if the targets of your operation already have this information, there ought to be no reason why the public should be denied that information. It's a very simple point I'm making. If you don't understand that, or if you think that this somehow compromises national security, or if you think, as you say, that the media has some other agenda, well, good luck to you. That wraps it up, this episode of Facebook Live. Thank you so much for joining us.